educated Indians cannot bring any work to completion. Allahabad agreed to have us. There was talk actually about national history, and they approached him to chair the editorial board. And he said, in case Allahabad agree to have me, they must endow me with full powers, exactly as Cambridge University did to Sir Wolseley Haig for the Cambridge history series of the Muslim period. If I have to correct and rewrite the rubbish which our Indian professors of history write. So this is the question, where is the ideal Republic of Letters? As I found to my bitter experience when editing the second volume of the Dhaka University History of Bengal, I must be paid an extra fee for this dhobi work. Sometimes Sarkar's idealistic moral criticism of what he saw as Indian scholars' habitual tendency towards laziness went to ridiculous extremes. He would allow young scholars to use his personal library only if he was convinced that they were genuine researchers, and there were tests you had to pass. When Suraj Narayan Rao came from the Jind state to work in his library in Calcutta in mid-December 1948 and worked all day, every day in the library, Sarkar would only see him at 4 p.m. with a cup of tea and silently sip a cup himself and leave after asking Rao to give a list of the materials he needed the next day. But that was not what I had in mind as my example of ridiculous extremes. The test that Rao had to pass is indicated in the following sentence in his reminiscences of Sir Jadunath, and Rao writes, "It was perhaps on the third day that one of his grandsons came to me and politely pointed out to me the bathroom for use, if and when I needed it." So, which means for the first 2 days, while the guy worked there the entire day, Sarkar was not going to tell him where the bathroom was, because he had to prove that he was a true researcher, completely dedicated to the cause. So where was the ideal Republic of Letters that Sarkar would find? Incidentally, I should say that, so there were two things where, what was opposed to the debating club, the Indian History Congress model, was what Sarkar thought of as a research seminar. Now, you know, research seminar was something that again originated in Germany. Bonnie Smith has a very good article on the German research seminar, but you can also find there was a particular way a German professor's office was organized. There's diagrams, you know, where the maps would be, where the sources would be. And the research seminar, we have research seminars in Chicago, but they're not really proper German research seminars. The research seminar is where you work with your students with original sources. And you read sources together. So Sarkar's idea of research seminar was actually that idea. And finally, after much talking about holding a research seminar, they were able to hold one in Kamshet, in the house where the students came, but such was the pressure of professionalizations that even their own students agreed to come only if they held it back to back with the History Congress, so that they could actually then go on to the History Congress. And the next year they couldn't organize it, the money wasn't there, there wasn't really much life to it, but here is, that's the Kamshet Research Seminar. And that's in the house where Sardeshai lived. And you know, this time I was in Pune, so I actually went to Kamshet to look for this house. And nobody knew where the house was. The Pune people couldn't tell me. Finally, I found it through a land developer who is just about to buy the house and sell it and build a because they are trying to make Kamshet into second Lonavla. That's all the billboards say. So that's the house where...
Who is sitting at the back on the chair?
I don't know, I have to make it, but you know, the Kannada people in the Kannada, there's Tikkekar amongst them. Tikkekar wrote up actually a pamphlet on this first meet, and so that's the house as it now stands. It didn't have the second floor, and that was or first floor in Indian terms. That was added later. So one was, there were two things that distinguished the model of research from PhD, Indian History Congress, presentation of papers, Barunde writing and letter of introduction, introducing myself to Vipan Chandra. The debating club model was to the professor had a research library, which was not a collection of secondary books. It was actually a collection of sources. And you studied with your student the sources, and you can find out more actually if you read the letters between Sarkar and Raghubir Singh, because the professor Sarkar would very much tell his students, when Raghubir Singh wrote the book Transition in Malwa, and there's letters from Sarkar, supervisory letters saying, just go to, of these documents, read these sections. You don't have to go beyond that. I've said the main story, and you just go and find out the detail about actually what happened in Malwa, and you don't need to read beyond the very interesting supervisory strategies. But that's what he opposed to the idea of. So, and he actually proudly said to Sardesai, a library with works in 6 or 7 languages, like mine, is indispensably necessary for the purpose of reconstructing chronology. And your whole Bombay presidency does not contain a single full or even decent library of Indian history like mine. They're very proud of his library, which unfortunately the National Library is now completely dispersed, unlike the Deccan College, which has kept Sardesai's library intact, or Tilak's library intact. But the Calcutta people, it's completely stupid. And he clearly said that he owes this to the Germans. He actually says, in addition to even certifying Sardesai as a historian, he says, in addition to the indefatigable industry and intellectual alertness characteristics of German scholarship, he has cultivated the German habit of methodological arrangement, blah, blah, blah. So the model somewhere was German historical research. In general, it may be said that an imaginary Europe, so these questions, who do I write for? I don't write for the debating club. I don't write for the rubbish that the Indian professors are. Who do I write for? And there's a very interesting irony there. See, Sarkar's mentor, in a way, was William Irvine. So basically, they learned history from these colonial officials. And eventually, the colonial officials would go back to England and review Sarkar's books in the Journal of Royal Asiatic Society. In a way, they never had a proper European readership. And that's a very interesting irony because these colonial officials, like for instance, Dodwell became a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies. So basically, Indian history was created in England as a subject by retired colonial officials, so not in Indian history. In fact, C.H. Phillips' reminiscence is very interesting. When he wrote, when C.H. Phillips finished his thesis on East India Company politics, one of his examiners was Namier. And Namier read it as a purely English history thesis. But he got a job eventually at SOAS to teach Indian history. And Namier actually advised him to cut down on the Indian stuff if he wanted to find a market for it in England. So that's a side story. It's an interesting story. So where was this ideal republic? So the ideal republic itself was an idealized Europe. And there's a letter that, after the Pune Daftar, Sardesai had edited some 45 volumes of records from the Pune Daftar. And they came out, and there's a letter from Sarkar comforting him for the very low-key reception he had because civil disobedience movement started while he was doing this work. And the government of Bombay wasn't paying for this work anymore, where their attention was elsewhere. There's a very angry letter from Sarkar saying, what is this demented Bania's son doing with the British government? My dear Nana, this letter reads, in Europe, your work as editor of the Peshwa's Daftar records would have been promptly recognized by your own university and every university where Maratha history is taught by conferring on you the honorary degree of D.Litt. In England, Mr. Loeb, a mere rich man, probably innocent of the classics, was created a doctor by the Cambridge University because he financed the issue of a new edition of the Greek and Latin classics. True scholars there are honored even more surely and quickly. But here, half the Senate and the Board of History are blissfully ignorant of the present state of research and names of research workers in Maratha history, and the other half are consumed by jealousy of your achievements. This has been my experience, too, he says, but I don't care, as I have secured recognition in Europe in no small measure. And it's a very ironical statement, because Sarkar never actually achieved recognition in Europe in any measure. If you talk about European history, if you read the major European historians, nobody knows of Sarkar. In his later life, he was made the first honorary fellow of the American Historical Society, but that's in the 50s. Here, on the other hand, one man takes the opportunity of his visit to any provincial university as an external examiner to whisper what he presents as mistakes in my work, and to his professor audience. And his professor audience, ignorant of Portuguese and Marathi, at least of that particular history, swallow his lies without questions. But as you can see, I survive these tactics. In England, there will be quicker and more ungrudging recognition of the series. And for this purpose, I am supplying the necessary information to my friends. And there's a peculiar sentence where he actually says, the English don't like reading hardback books. So you should have paperback editions to send to England. I don't know where that came from. But the reason why I say that it's more complicated, when Sarkar was made the Vice-Chancellor of University of Calcutta, he got a lot of trouble from the Ashutosh followers. And he was forced to depend on the British and the Muslim leadership in the university in order to contain them. So they spread the canard that Sarkar was a Khair Khan of the British. But actually, if you read through him, what you see is there's a different imagination of the nation, basically. There's a kind of nationalism that's at stake, which is defeated in all the debates about nationalism. I mean, in other words, one has to grant India varieties of nationalisms in this period in order to see from where the debates about research, truth, archives were coming from. And Sarkar's nationalism was, I mean, I've written about it elsewhere in detail. I'll just simply say that he belonged to that strand of particularly Bengali, but also later on Maratha intelligentsia. But the Bengalis were affected by this much earlier than other parts of intellectuals from other parts of India, what you could call providentialism. This idea that there was providence at work in the British ruling India. Now, providence, it becomes a very old Christian concept, becomes a very important Protestant Christian concept. It's very important in Ranke's work. In a way that Ranke equalizes different histories is by saying that all histories are equidistant from God. And we don't, but, and there's a very interesting debate. I mean, Hegel's philosophy of history begins by debating whether or not you can know providence. Because there's one Christian position which actually says, Ranke's position, that I can't know providence. So I don't know what God has provided for a particular history, where Hegel's argument was that you can use reason to work out what providence is. So Marx, in a way, is a follower, but that's, again, a side argument. But I think that the providentialist, this disinterested design, there are cultural indic elements because of this. Eventually, he would say that this preparedness that you have to work on making yourself a receptacle of truth, he would use the word chitta shuddhi, which is very much sort of a Vedantic word, and was being used by other people. And finally, in a book he actually wrote, it's also civilizational, because he actually wrote that India should not, I'm quoting, plume herself in borrowed feathers of European civilization. See you, Rajiv. Surely idealizing a Europe of the mind as the, so my point is that idealizing Europe of the mind as the home of scholarship was not an exercise in blind imitation. It was actually an exercise in imagining an alternative India, which of course never won the debate. There are many places where one can go to actually track this utopia, but in finishing, let me then finish with an example of how all his life he had to kind of fight the battle in spite of his utopia. In the friendship, in that intimate friendship with Sardesai, he had to come to terms with the actual development in Indian history, where Indian history never got dissociated from regional pride, from caste assertion, from identity assertion, from religious pride, because this whole question, what is it there in my past that I can be proud of, became a very important political question. And this remained a kind of understated battle between Sarkar and Sardesai throughout their lives. So I'll just end with this story. When Sardesai was finishing the final volume of his New History of Marathas, Sarkar would often be deeply uncomfortable with the way his friend used historical sources, and often expressed strong criticisms in his letters. Throughout the 1940s, as the different volumes of the New Histories of the Marathas came out, their debates continued in private. Faced with Sarkar's insistent criticism of his use of sources, Sardesai sometimes acted defensively and took refuge in the thought, which he expressed, that what he was writing was not scientific history, but a text in some other older genre, a kaifiyat, or an apologia. He writes to Sarkar, I have on purpose put in Shivaji's estimates by foreign writers. July 1944. The Marathas have long suffered from foreign attacks on all sides. My work is essentially a Maratha kaifiyat. Sarkar writes back in December 45 to say that he did not approve of the tone or style of Sardesai's draft introduction. And he writes, it's too much like the modern political platform oration from some political aspirant, and does not breathe the calm judicial spirit of a true historian who confidently waits for his work to last beyond the ephemeral controversies of the present day, and then he offers to rewrite it. He said, let me write it for you. Wholesale, actually that's a quote, that's a word in his text, let me rewrite it wholesale. Sardesai politely refused, I do not wish to put you to so much labor. Sarkar continued with his criticism the following 2 years. True, Sarkar wrote, interpretation must differ according to the writer's personality. But the basis of your conclusions must be unquestionable facts, as established by latest research, and not mere conjecture. Moreover, the interpretation must be such as to convince an impartial observer. This in a letter that requests Sardesai to please destroy this letter after reading it, because it is from a sincere friend. Sarkar is filled with despair on reading drafts of the last chapters of your volume 3. In particular, to read Sardesai, quote, on the heroic role of the Pindaris. And he says, I have therefore made no attempt to modify or correct them from my point of view. And again in 1947, what pained me most was your attitude to historical evidence and certain political theories. Contrary to Sarkar's public stance, the private letters show how closely intertwined were the two modes of history writing in India. Their conversation is actually almost you could read it as an allegory of a national conversation between this debate, which I think is still around us, about the question of historical objectivity. On the one hand, involving one's pride in particular identities, and history that aspires to some universal principles of objectivity. It is interesting to see that till the very end, Sardesai retained the wish to clothe his historical claims about the Marathas in some genre that resisted objective history, kaifiyat, table talk, and so on, even after Sarkar had explicitly warned him that a historical book meant for permanent place on the library shelf is not table talk. He sent Sardesai Sarkar sent Sarkar a draft, farewell, for his last volume, for the correction of a particular sentence that he was unhappy with. So he had drafted it and said, I'm not happy with this sentence, can you help me change it? That's the kind of degree of intimacy. So the frisson is very interesting. I find it extremely significant that Sarkar, okay, so Sardesai himself described his work as table talk and then crossed it out in deference to Sarkar, I assume. I find it extremely interesting that Sarkar, who drastically revised that particular sentence at Sardesai's request, let the expression table talk stand. Sardesai had originally written, I do not claim to be a scholar or even a trained historian, but an eager, tireless student. Call this my final work, if you like it, the endless table talk of a garrulous old man. This is what Sardesai had written. He then himself took out the expression table talk and changed it to read, I do not claim to be a scholar or even a trained historian, but an eager, tireless student. Call this my final work, if you like, the endless outpourings of an ardent heart. And here is how Sarkar revised the sentence, while restoring, perhaps with a mixture of feelings, the expression table talk to its original position. And that is exactly how the sentence stands in the book. So I'll tell you the words that Sarkar changes. I do not claim to be a scholar or even a trained historian, but only an eager, circled by Jadunath Sarkar, tireless, crossed out by Jadunath Sarkar, Ernest, inserted by Jadunath Sarkar, worker. Call this, circled by Jadunath Sarkar in pencil, my final work, if you like it, crossed out and then restored by Jadunath Sarkar, the long, inserted and then crossed out by Jadunath Sarkar, endless, crossed out by Jadunath Sarkar, table talk retained by Jadunath Sarkar, of a garrulous crossed out by Jadunath Sarkar, student underlined by Sardesai but crossed out by Jadunath Sarkar, lifelong seeker after knowledge inserted by Jadunath Sarkar. And that's how the sentence stands in the final version. So in his private life then, Sarkar knew or had to accommodate himself to history as it was actually being written in India. And I think that correspondence shows the discipline's close and fraught relationship to the concrete facts of Indian politics. But he refused to adopt that stance in public. Indian history, Indian scholarship, Indian nationalist movement were never what he wanted them to be. He had nothing but contempt for the political class. Somehow that sentence rings differently today. Nothing but contempt for the political class, whom he described as the white cap patriots, who could cash in their patriotism in bogus joint stock banks. Sarkar was in many ways a man of the past by the 1940s, but he would not make a norm out of the actual everyday reality of India. He would rather be defeated. His romantic idealist version of the nation, of which his understanding of research, disinterestedness, and objective seemed to have been a part, came to be shot through with this ethics of defeat as India decolonized, and history, ceasing to be the self-elected vocation for the few, became an ordinary profession for the many. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dipesh, for putting so much life and problems and tension into something that could so easily have been dismissed as, you know, a derivation, Rankianism, and so on. I don't know about the time factor. Do we need to wrap up right now? Because I know the main discussion is not going to be held now.
Maybe we can have a few questions.
Maybe if someone's not, you know, urgently.
Oh, the last part, okay. Yeah, that's just the two of them. I think in township again.
I wonder if you could, with your materials, talk about you know, this period where, as you said, the notion of historical research is being formulated, and how it might relate to a slightly earlier period, or also parallel to it, of the composition of literary history of Hindi and Urdu, and the idea of how the literary historian must do historical research. And I'm thinking of people like Ramchandra Shukla and Mohammad Hussain Azad. And are there ways in which you know the sort of worrying the question of evidence might be
Let the room settle down a bit. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of give and take. You know, I mean, my friend Gautam Bhadra, when he wrote on the history of the Jal Pratap Chandra case in Bengal, one of the things that he showed quite interestingly is how the Indian Evidence Act was read by people who were actually trying to write the history of that case. So there was a kind of a conversation between, again, the presence of law and legal discourse in everyday life and the question of evidence. But I also think that Bhavani Raman's book, the recently published book, which I think is very interesting, showing how the role that even earlier in the 19th century antiquarians play by emphasizing, in creating a mentality that is more receptive to the idea of facts. You know? So in a way, her argument is that the antiquarians prepare the ground for the later development of historical writings. Yeah. But these literary histories are completely, at least, I mean, Tanika referred to one of the essays that I had written on literature and identity. So there's in Bengali literary history, there's a very interesting debate called the Chandidas Debate. Because there are all these padas by Chandidas, all signed as Chandidas. So there was a debate about, which Chandidas is the real Chandidas or the original Chandidas. And Dinesh Chandra Sen, who was the first big literary historian, his standard of proof, which Suniti Chatterjee and others naturally lampooned, was that the real Chandidas was one who made him cry. He said, I know the real Chandidas because he immediately brings tears to my eyes. And even today, there's a man called Shankari Prasad Boshu who's written about Vidyapati and Chandidas, and he takes that position. So there's obviously a strand of thinking where you actually think the real is in your experience, and your experience is a guide to what is genuinely, Chandidas. So I think, again, as I was saying, that these are all these strands of, they're in conversation, so, which is why Jadunath's Puritanism was almost bound to be defeated.
How does this moral idealism play out in the history that he wrote compared to
Very,
the history that
right. Well, let me just quickly give you one. I mean, I have a whole chapter discussing the idea of character. Because, one of the things that you notice in colonial historians, and this is obviously something they carry on from European historical tradition. Hume's History of England has it. So there's a tendency in European history writing, at least from 18th century, to have a separate passage on the character of a king. And this eventually develops into this idea that character itself is an abstract causal force in history. And they were deeply influenced by Carlyle's essays on heroism, and particularly the essay called The Hero as King, which both the Maratha historians used, Jadunath Sarkar used. But so I have a chapter in which I try to distinguish between what, and so if you come to Irvine's later Mughals and then on to Jadunath, you'll find them actually often writing a separate passage on somebody's character. Whereas if you read the late Mughal historians, the early Muslim historians, it's much more embedded in discussions, and has very different implications. Sometimes, character belongs to the nobility. If you're a rice person, you have character. Whereas in the European documents from the 18th century on, there's this idea that that character is something you can imbibe. Character, it will eventually become Samuel Smiles. And Jadunath, of course, was very deeply influenced by the Brahmo Samaj and used to go there as a student. That spine I showed you was a very Bengali Victorian spine, and it kind of had a lingering history into our school days when parents would always pull us up for not sitting erect. So if you see your parents coming, you suddenly sat up and then kind of slouched into a natural position. So I think it plays out in that history writing in a philosophical form, where you assume that character is a causal force in history. And so I kind of, there's a chapter I've written on distinguishing and on the distinguishing features of the idea of character. And then in European history, of course, it has a very interesting relationship to Renaissance dramas, which revise some older Greek concepts of character. So in a way, in the literary discussions quite early on, there's an acceptance that character is a construction. So, in other words, the character of somebody is always different from the flesh and blood person. But this understanding is obviously diluted in the 18th, 19th century when you actually think you can be that two-dimensional person. Right? So there's a kind of a denial of your own complexity. Young Jadunath Sarkar, when he was he used to write a diary, which is not available. Only few pages from the 1890s are available in the National Library files. And there's one very interesting passage which he writes in English, referring to himself as homo, as in homo eke homo. He writes about homo's sexual passions, well, as sinful thoughts, of course. Not, but later Jadunath would absolutely have no place for this, and he's constantly sort of coming down on kings who are either sexually passionate or like women, and wine. So there is it plays out. So it plays out at a philosophical level, but at the same time, he saw himself as his own method. And that's why he thought only few people can do history, because you yourself had to become the method of doing history. So if character was an abstract social force, only a person with character could find out the truth about it, right? Because in the end, you have to produce a critique of somebody's character, either of Shivaji's or Aurangzeb's, and that I try to show linked up interestingly in the providentialism, with the providentialism argument. Maybe we can reserve the rest of the questions for tomorrow? Okay.
Yes. So thank you all once again, and thank you, Dipesh, for a wonderful session.